The morning sun painted golden streaks across the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows that danced across the perfectly manicured courtyard. Guard Thomas Harrison stood like a bronze statue at his designated post, his scarlet, red uniform pressed to perfection, and his towering, black bearskin hat positioned with the precision that only comes from years of military discipline. The golden buttons on his tunic gleamed in the early light, each one polished until it reflected the sky above like tiny mirrors. For 3 years, Thomas had mastered the seemingly impossible art of remaining completely motionless while hundreds of curious tourists gathered around him every single day, his feet encased in perfectly polished black boots, had learned to ignore the ache that came from standing in one position for hours. His hands, gripping his rifle with practiced ease, never trembled, despite the weight of the weapon. His eyes, trained to look straight ahead, had developed an almost supernatural ability to see everything happening in his peripheral vision without moving even a fraction of an inch. Thomas had witnessed it all during his time as one of the Queen's guard. Children would approach him with wide, innocent eyes, jumping up and down while waving their tiny hands frantically, hoping desperately to catch his attention and make him smile. Their parents would encourage them, thinking it was harmless fun, unaware of the intense mental discipline required to ignore such pure, joyful energy. Teenagers, bolder and more challenging, would pose for endless selfies, making increasingly ridiculous faces just inches from his nose, their laughter echoing off the palace walls as they tried every trick they could think of to break his concentration. Adults presented their own unique challenges. Some would whisper jokes directly into his ear, their breath warm against his skin as they shared stories they thought might amuse him. Others would ask him direct questions about the weather, his family, or his opinions on current events, genuinely surprised when he failed to respond. Elderly visitors often treated him with more respect, but even they would sometimes test his resolve with gentle comments about how handsome he looked in his uniform, or how proud his mother must be of his service. This particular Tuesday morning started exactly like the hundreds of others that had come before it. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of the palace gardens where roses bloomed in carefully tended beds. The sound of traffic from the busy London streets created a constant background hum, punctuated by the occasional honk of a taxi or the rumble of a red double-decker bus carrying its own load of tourists eager to explore the city. The first visitors of the day arrived as the morning mist was still lifting from the grass. A family from Italy approached Thomas's position with the kind of nervous excitement that comes with being in the presence of something truly iconic. The mother, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, giggled nervously as she positioned herself beside Thomas for what would surely become a treasured family photograph. Her hands shook slightly as she smoothed down her dress. Clearly understanding the significance of this moment, her husband, a tall man with a warm smile, held up his camera and began counting down in rapid Italian, his voice carrying the musical quality of his native language. He called out cheerfully, the flash of his camera capturing not just the image but the pure joy radiating from his wife's face. Meanwhile, their twin boys, perhaps 8 years old, stood frozen in place as they stared up at Thomas with the kind of wonder that only children can truly experience. Their mouths hung open in amazement, their young minds struggling to process how anyone could stand so perfectly still. Behind the Italian family, a group of college students from America had formed an orderly line, their backpacks slung over their shoulders and guidebooks tucked under their arms. They spoke in hushed, excited whispers about the research they had done before their trip, sharing facts they had learned about the Queen's Guard from websites and travel blogs. One young woman, clearly the leader of their group, consulted her phone repeatedly, reading aloud from an article about the history and significance of the guards who protected the royal family. As the morning progressed, the courtyard began to fill with a diverse tapestry of humanity. Japanese tourists approached with deep, respectful bows, their cameras clicking softly as they captured images they would treasure forever.
Ow.
An elderly couple from Canada, both wearing matching windbreakers and comfortable walking shoes, stood nearby, sharing stories about their own son who served in their country's military. The woman's eyes misted slightly as she spoke about the pride she felt watching Thomas maintain his disciplined stance. reminded of her own child's dedication to serve as French teenagers, loud and boisterous in the way that only young people can be gathered in an excited cluster as they planned increasingly elaborate poses for their social media posts. Their laughter was infectious, and even some of the more reserved tourists found themselves smiling at the group's enthusiasm. The morning atmosphere was filled with the cheerful buzz of different languages mixing together like instruments in an orchestra, creating a symphony of human curiosity and wonder that had played out in this very spot for generations. The courtyard itself seemed to welcome these daily gatherings, its ancient stones having witnessed countless similar scenes throughout the centuries. The very walls held the echoes of history, and every visitor, whether they realized it or not, was adding their own small chapter to the ongoing story of this remarkable place. As the morning sun climbed higher in the clear London sky, Thomas noticed the steady stream of visitors, growing into what could only be described as a river of humanity flowing through the palace courtyard. The gentle trickle of early morning tourists had transformed into a constant parade of excited sightseers, each group bringing its own energy and expectations to this historic setting. Tour buses, their sides decorated with colorful advertisements promising London's best attractions, arrived with mechanical precision every few minutes, disgorging fresh loads of eager travelers who had waited months or even years for this moment. The sounds of the courtyard had evolved from the quiet murmurs of the first visitors into a rich tapestry of human voices. Conversations in dozens of languages created a constant background symphony, with occasional bursts of laughter or excited exclamations punctuating the steady hum. Children's voices rose above the adult conversations, their high-pitched squeals of delight mixing with the deeper tones of parents, trying to maintain some semblance of order while simultaneously sharing in their children's wonder. Among the newest arrivals was a wedding party that had clearly made an impromptu stop during their celebration. The bride, resplendent in a flowing white gown that seemed to shimmer in the morning light, insisted on photographs despite the obvious challenges her elaborate dress presented. Her train spread across the ancient cobblestones like spilled cream, while her bridesmaids, dressed in coordinating shades of pale blue, fussed around her, ensuring every detail was perfect. The groom, handsome in his black tuxedo, beamed with pride as he watched his new wife's joy at being photographed next to one of London's most famous symbols. Street musicians had claimed strategic positions around the courtyard's perimeter, their cases open to collect coins from generous passersby. The elderly man with weathered hands played haunting melodies on a violin that had clearly seen decades of use, his music floating through the air and adding a soundtrack to the visual spectacle. Nearby, a young woman with bright purple hair strummed an acoustic guitar while singing folk songs in a clear, sweet voice that drew small crowds of appreciative listeners. The arrival of a large school group from Loudest, Germany marked a noticeable shift. In the courtyard's energy level, their teacher, Herr Weber, was a man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patient demeanor that comes from years of managing energetic teenagers. He carried a clipboard and wore a slightly harried expression as he attempted to keep his charges organized while simultaneously trying to provide them with educational context for what they were experiencing. The 20 German students under Herr Weber's care represented the full spectrum of teenage enthusiasm and curiosity. Some approached Thomas with genuine reverence, clearly understanding the historical significance of what they were witnessing. Others, however, viewed him more as an elaborate piece of street theater, a living statue placed there specifically for their entertainment. These students began testing the boundaries of acceptable behavior almost immediately upon arrival. Thomas, maintaining his stoic pose despite the increasing chaos around him, found his peripheral vision filled with the movements of these young people as they grew bolder by the minute. His training had prepared him for enthusiastic crowds, but there was something different about this particular group. Where most tourists maintained an instinctive respect for his position and uniform, these teenagers seemed to view his silence as a challenge to be overcome rather than a tradition to be honored. One girl, whose name tag identified her as Lisa, had appointed herself the unofficial leader of the more adventurous students. She had striking blue eyes and blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that often leads teenagers into situations they haven't fully thought through. Lisa began by standing closer to Thomas than most visitors dared, studying his face intently as if she could decode the secrets of his discipline through careful observation. "He's not even real," she announced to her classmates in German, her voice carrying the dismissive tone that teenagers often use when they want to appear worldly and unimpressed. "He's probably just a wax figure they've put here to fool the tourists." Her friends giggled nervously at this bold declaration, though several cast uncertain glances at Thomas, clearly not entirely convinced by Lisa's theory. Encouraged by the laughter of her peers, Lisa decided to test her hypothesis more directly. She began making exaggerated facial expressions just inches from Thomas's nose, contorting her features into increasingly ridiculous poses while her classmates snapped photos and videos on their phones. When this failed to elicit any response, she escalated to waving her hands dramatically in front of his eyes, creating elaborate patterns in the air, as if she were casting a magic spell to bring him to life. The other tourists in the area began to take notice of the German student's increasingly disruptive behavior. An American family who had been patiently waiting their turn for photos exchanged uncomfortable glances before deciding to move to a different area of the courtyard. The father, a middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap emblazoned with his university's logo, could be heard explaining to his young son that sometimes people don't show proper respect for important traditions. The Italian family that had taken the first photographs of the morning also retreated to a more peaceful location, a mother shaking her head sadly at the lack of reverence being displayed by the teenagers. Her twin boys, still wide-eyed with wonder at Thomas's incredible stillness, tugged at their parents' sleeves and asked in confused whispers why the older children were being so rude to the nice soldier. Even the street musicians seemed affected by the change in atmosphere. The violin player's melodies took on a slightly more discordant tone, while the folk singer found herself having to compete with the increasing volume of the German students' antics. Several elderly visitors gathered near the musicians, clearly seeking refuge from the chaos developing around Thomas's post. Despite the growing disruption, Thomas maintained his professional composure with the dedication that had made him one of the most respected guards in his unit. However, beneath his perfectly controlled exterior, he was acutely aware of every movement, every sound, every escalation in behavior that was occurring around him. His training had taught him to recognize the signs of a situation that might require intervention, and those signs were becoming more apparent with each passing minute. The situation took a decidedly more serious turn when one of the German students, a lanky 17-year-old named Klaus, decided that his classmates weren't being nearly bold enough in their attempts to get a reaction from Thomas. Klaus had been watching the guard intently for the past several minutes, his sharp brown eyes studying every detail of the uniform, the posture, and most importantly, the gleaming rifle that Thomas held with such unwavering precision. Unlike his more impulsive classmates, Klaus was the type of teenager who approached challenges methodically, analyzing situations before acting. He had been observing the other tourists' interactions with Thomas, noting how far each person dared to venture, and what types of behaviors seemed to be tolerated. In his mind, he was conducting a scientific experiment, testing the limits of what this living statue would endure before breaking character. Klaus whispered his intentions to his closest friends, a small group of boys who looked up to him as something of a leader, despite his quiet demeanor. "I'm going to touch his gun," he announced in German, his voice low but filled with the kind of determination that worried even his most adventurous peers. Several of his friends immediately began shaking their heads, trying to dissuade him with urgent whispers about how that seemed like a very bad idea. "You're crazy," hissed his friend Marcus, a shorter boy with curly red hair who had always been the voice of reason in their group. "That's a real weapon. You could get in serious trouble." But Klaus merely smiled with the confidence that comes from being 17 years old and believing that rules are meant to be tested, especially when those rules weren't explicitly explained. Herr Weber, their teacher, was unfortunately positioned on the opposite side of the courtyard at that crucial moment, engaged in an animated discussion with another tour guide about the historical significance of the palace architecture. He was checking his watch repeatedly, clearly concerned about maintaining their tight schedule for the day's London tour, which included stops at the Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, and a Thames River cruise. His attention was divided between managing his students and ensuring they stayed on track for their educational itinerary. The other. German teenagers began forming a loose semicircle around Klaus and Thomas, some encouraging their friend's bold plan while others looked increasingly worried about the potential consequences. Lisa, who had been the instigator of much of the earlier misbehavior, now found herself in the unusual position of being the voice of caution. "Maybe we should just take normal photos like everyone else," she suggested, but her words were lost in the excited chatter of their classmates. Thomas, despite maintaining his perfectly stoic expression, was acutely aware of every subtle shift in the crowd's behavior through his highly developed peripheral vision. Years of training had taught him to process multiple streams of information simultaneously, without appearing to notice anything at all. He could sense Klaus approaching from his left side, could hear the urgent whispers in German, even though he didn't understand the language, and could feel the tension in the air as the situation escalated beyond normal tourist curiosity. The rifle Klaus was fixated on was no mere ceremonial prop. It was a fully functional SA-80 assault rifle, loaded and ready for use in the unlikely event that Thomas needed to defend the royal residence. The weapon represented not just military authority, but the very real responsibility Thomas carried to protect one of the most important buildings in the British Commonwealth. Every aspect of his training had emphasized the sacred nature of his equipment and the absolute prohibition against allowing civilians to make contact with it under any circumstances. The other tourists in the immediate area seemed to sense that something significant was about to occur, though most couldn't quite articulate what was making them feel increasingly uneasy. Conversations grew quieter, cameras stopped clicking, and parents instinctively pulled their children closer. The elderly Canadian couple who had been sharing military stories stepped back several paces, their experienced eyes recognizing the telltale signs of a situation about to reach a critical point. Even the street musicians appeared to sense the change in atmosphere. The violin player's melody grew softer and more tentative, while the folk singer found herself glancing nervously toward Thomas's post between songs. The wedding party, still posing for photographs nearby, remained blissfully unaware of the developing tension. But their photographer noticed the shift and began steering them toward a different location for their remaining shots. Klaus took another step closer to Thomas, his eyes fixed on the rifle with laser-like intensity. His friends continued their urgent whispers, trying to talk him out of what they increasingly saw as a terrible mistake. But Klaus had reached that point of teenage determination where backing down would feel like admitting defeat. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, and the pressure to prove his bravery had overcome any reasonable concerns about consequences. Thomas's heartbeat remained steady and controlled, but every muscle in his body was now on high alert. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, where civilian curiosity crossed the line into potential security concerns. The protocols were clear and unambiguous. No unauthorized person was allowed to touch his weapon under any circumstances, and any attempt to do so would be met with immediate and decisive action. The morning that had begun so peacefully, filled with the innocent wonder of tourists eager to experience a piece of British history, was now balanced on the edge of a moment that would transform everyone's understanding of what they were truly witnessing. Klaus's hand was now mere inches from the bayonet attached to Thomas's rifle, and the entire courtyard seemed to hold its collective breath in anticipation of what would happen next. The instant Klaus's fingertips made the slightest contact with the cold metal of Thomas's bayonet, something extraordinary happened. The guard who had stood motionless for hours, who had seemed more like a masterfully crafted statue than a living, breathing human being, suddenly exploded into action with a force and intensity that no one in the courtyard could have possibly anticipated. Thomas's transformation was instantaneous and complete. In one fluid motion that spoke to years of rigorous military training, he shifted his stance, straightened his already perfect posture even further, and opened his mouth to deliver a command that would reverberate through the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace and echo in the memories of every person present for years to come. "Make way for the Queen's Guard." The words erupted from Thomas's throat with such tremendous power and authority that they seemed to shake the very foundation of the courtyard itself. His voice, unused for hours of silent duty, burst forthwith. The accumulated force of his dedication, training, and absolute commitment to his role as protector of the crown. The command wasn't just heard. It was felt in the chests of every person within 100 yards, a sonic boom of military authority that cut through the morning air like a sword through silk. The sheer volume and intensity of Thomas's voice was beyond anything the tourists had ever experienced. This wasn't the polite request of a security guard or the firm instruction of a police officer. This was the battle cry of a professional soldier, trained to make his voice carry across battlefields to command attention. In life-or-death situations, to communicate absolute authority in a single moment. The sound seemed to come not just from his throat, but from his entire being. Channeled through years of discipline and dedication to duty, Klaus's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The teenager, who had been leaning forward with confident curiosity, just moments before, jerked backward as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning. His face, which had been flushed with the excitement of teenage rebellion, instantly drained of all color, becoming as white as fresh snow. His brown eyes, previously sparkling with mischief, now widened to the size of dinner plates filled with a mixture of shock, terror, and the sudden, crushing realization that he had made a terrible mistake. The boy's legs, which had carried him confidently toward his target just seconds earlier, now betrayed him completely. He stumbled backward, his coordination destroyed by the shock of Thomas's thunderous command, and nearly lost his balance entirely. Only the quick reflexes of his friend Marcus, who reached out to steady him, prevented Klaus from falling flat on his back in front of the entire crowd. But the impact of Thomas's command extended far beyond just Klaus. The other German teenagers, who had been giggling and encouraging their friend's reckless behavior, now stood frozen in place like a collection of wax figures themselves. Lisa, who had been the ringleader of much of their inappropriate conduct, looked as though she had been slapped across the face. Her mouth hung open in shock, and her hands trembled slightly as the full weight of what they had witnessed settled over her. The ripple effect of Thomas's voice spread outward through the courtyard like shock waves from an earthquake. Every single conversation stopped mid-sentence. Children who had been laughing and playing froze where they stood, their small hands instinctively reaching for their parents' protective embrace. Adults who had been chatting casually about their vacation plans or the weather suddenly found themselves unable to speak, their minds struggling to process what they had just experienced. The Italian family, who had started the morning with such joy and excitement, now stood transfixed. The mother, who had giggled so sweetly while posing for photos, now wore an expression of awe mixed with concern. Her husband lowered his camera without taking a picture, his finger hovering over the shutter button as he tried to understand what had just occurred. Their twin boys pressed closer to their parents, their earlier fascination with Thomas now tinged with a healthy respect for the power he represented. The American college students found themselves in the surreal position of having captured something truly extraordinary on their phones and cameras. The young woman who had been reading historical facts from her guidebook now stared at Thomas with newfound appreciation for the living history she was witnessing. Her classmates stood motionless behind her, their backpacks and casual tourist gear suddenly seeming inappropriate in the face of such raw military authority. The Japanese tourists, with their ingrained cultural understanding of respect and hierarchy, immediately bowed deeper than they had before. Their cameras, which had been clicking steadily throughout the morning, remained silent as they absorbed the gravity of what they had witnessed. Several of them exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing that they had just experienced something far beyond the typical tourist attraction, even the elderly Canadian couple. With their own military background and understanding of discipline, stood with renewed respect and admiration. The woman's eyes filled with tears as Thomas's command reminded her powerfully of her own son's service, while her husband straightened his own shoulders unconsciously, his body remembering its own military bearing from decades past. The street performers had stopped their music entirely, their instruments falling silent, as if commanded by some invisible conductor. The violin player stood with his bow suspended in midair, while the folk singer forgot the words to her song entirely. The sudden absence of background music made Thomas's command seem to echo endlessly off the palace walls, creating an almost cathedral-like silence in the usually bustling courtyard. The wedding party, which had been lost in their own celebration just moments before, now found their joy tempered by the realization that they had been witnessing something far more significant than a mere photo opportunity. The bride's flowing white dress seemed to flutter in the breeze as she stood perfectly still, her earlier insistence on photographs now forgotten in the face of this display of duty and dedication. Herr Weber, finally alerted to the situation, by Thomas's command, looked up from his clipboard with an expression of horror and embarrassment that would haunt him for years to come. His face flushed deep red as he realized that one of his students had created an international incident through their disrespectful behavior, and he began hurrying toward Klaus with apologies already forming on his lips. The silence that followed Thomas's thunderous command was unlike anything the courtyard had ever experienced. It wasn't simply the absence of sound, but rather a profound, almost sacred quiet that seemed to wrap itself around every person present like a heavy blanket. The usual symphony of tourist chatter, camera clicks, and city noise had been replaced by something approaching reverence. As if Thomas's voice had transformed the bustling courtyard into the hushed interior of a great cathedral, everyone remained frozen in place, their bodies instinctively responding to the authority they had just witnessed. Even as their minds struggled to process the dramatic transformation they had observed, parents who had been casually supervising their children now held them protectively close. Their parental instincts, triggered by the sudden shift from playful tourism to serious military authority, elderly visitors stood with renewed posture, their own memories of wartime and service bringing them to unconscious attention. Thomas himself began the gradual process of returning to his ceremonial stance. But the change in him was palpable and permanent. His breathing remained controlled and steady, each inhalation and exhalation measured with the precision of a man who had spent years mastering every aspect of his physical and mental discipline. His face slowly settled back into its neutral expression, but something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between him and every person in the courtyard, where before, Thomas had been viewed primarily as a curiosity, a living piece of British pageantry placed there for the entertainment and education of tourists. He was now unmistakably recognized as exactly what he had always been, a professional soldier, highly trained, deeply committed, and absolutely serious about his duties. The red uniform and towering bearskin hat were no longer mere costume elements, but symbols of genuine authority backed by the full power of military discipline and royal protection protocols. Klaus remained several feet away from Thomas, his entire body trembling with the aftershock of his encounter with real authority. The teenager's face had not regained any of its earlier color, and his hands shook visibly as the magnitude of his mistake continued to sink in. His friends surrounded him with worried whispers, their earlier encouragement of his reckless behavior now replaced by genuine concern for his well-being and their collective fear of the consequences that might follow. Marcus, Klaus's closest friend, kept one steady hand on his friend's shoulder while casting nervous glances toward Thomas and then toward their approaching teacher. "I told you this was a bad idea," he whispered urgently in German, his voice barely audible, even in the profound quiet of the courtyard. "I told you that rifle wasn't a toy." The other German students nodded in agreement. Their earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of reality. Herr Weber finally reached his students, his face a portrait of mortification and professional embarrassment. As an educator responsible for introducing young people to different cultures and historical traditions, he understood better than anyone how badly his students had failed to show appropriate respect. His wire-rimmed glasses had slipped down, his nose in his haste to reach Klaus, and he pushed them back up with shaking fingers as he began speaking in rapid, urgent German. "Was haben Sie gedacht?" He hissed at Klaus, his usual patient demeanor replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "Do you have any idea what you could have caused?" He cast apologetic glances toward Thomas, even though the guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, and began formulating the apologies he would need to offer to tour officials, school administrators, and possibly even diplomatic Personnel, the transformation in the behavior of all the tourists was remarkable and immediate. Those who had been planning to approach Thomas for photographs now maintained respectful distances, as if an invisible barrier had been erected around his position. Conversations, when they resumed at all, were conducted in hushed, reverent tones that acknowledged the gravity of what they had witnessed. New tourists arriving in the courtyard quickly sensed that something significant had occurred. Word spread through the crowd in whispered conversations and urgent text messages, as those who had witnessed Thomas's command shared their experience with friends and family, members who had missed the dramatic moment. The story grew and evolved with each telling, but the central message remained consistent. The quiet guard was far more than he appeared to be. Parents used the incident as an impromptu teaching moment for their children, explaining concepts of respect, authority, and the serious nature of military service. The Italian mother knelt down to speak quietly with her twin boys, helping them understand that the guard's job was important and demanding, requiring the kind of discipline and dedication that deserved their admiration rather than their amusement. The American college students found themselves reviewing the footage they had captured with newfound appreciation for its historical and cultural significance. What they had initially expected to be simple vacation photos had become documentation of a moment when ceremony revealed its underlying reality, when tradition demonstrated its living power, and when respect was taught through direct experience. Rather than textbook explanation, camera phones and digital cameras throughout the courtyard had indeed captured the entire incident, and several tourists were already beginning to upload their videos and photos to social media platforms. Comments and reactions began pouring in from around the world within minutes, as people shared their own experiences with military protocol and expressed admiration for Thomas's professional handling of the situation. The videos would eventually be viewed millions of times, shared across continents, and discussed in forums dedicated to military history, British culture, and travel experiences. News outlets would pick up the story, using it to educate viewers about the real responsibilities and training of the Queen's Guard, spelling the common misconception that they were merely decorative figures in elaborate costumes. For Thomas himself, the incident represented both a successful application of his training and a reminder of why his role was so important. He had maintained the dignity and security of his position while educating the public about the boundaries that must be respected. The satisfaction he felt was not from having intimidated a teenager, but from having upheld the standards and traditions that he had sworn to protect. The peaceful atmosphere of the courtyard was gradually beginning to return, but it would never be quite the same as it had been that morning. Every visitor now understood that they were not simply observing a tourist attraction, but witnessing a living tradition carried out by real soldiers with real responsibilities and real authority. To enforce the respect that their position demanded, Thomas gradually returned to his original position, his breathing controlled and steady. His face returned to its neutral expression, but something fundamental had changed. Where before he had been seen as a curiosity or photo opportunity, he was now clearly recognized as the professional soldier he had always been. Klaus stood trembling, several feet away, his friends surrounding him with concerned whispers. The boy's face was still pale. His hands shook as he realized the magnitude of what he had almost done. Mr. Weber reached the group and immediately began apologizing in broken English, clearly mortified by his student's behavior. The other tourists began to reorganize themselves, but with a completely different energy. People still wanted photographs, but they approached much more carefully now. They positioned themselves at respectful distances and spoke in hushed, reverent tones. Parents held their children's hands firmly, and the overall mood became almost cathedral-like in its solemnity. Camera phones had captured the entire incident, and several tourists were already reviewing their footage with amazement. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment where ceremony met reality in the most dramatic way possible. As the minutes slowly ticked by and the immediate shock of Thomas's powerful command began to settle into memory, the courtyard of Buckingham Palace underwent a remarkable transformation. A lesson that had been delivered in that single, thunderous moment continued to ripple outward through the crowd, creating changes that would extend far beyond the palace walls and long past this particular Tuesday morning. The German students, led by their deeply embarrassed teacher, had retreated to the far side of the courtyard where Herr Weber was conducting what could only be described as an emergency educational session. Klaus sat on a low stone wall, his head in his hands, still struggling to process the intensity of what he had experienced. The other teenagers gathered around him in a protective circle, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine concern for their friend's emotional state. "I've never heard anything so loud in my life," Klaus whispered to Marcus, his voice still shaking. With the aftershock of Thomas's command, it felt like it went right through my bones. His friend nodded sympathetically, understanding that Klaus had learned a lesson about respect and authority that no textbook or classroom lecture could have provided. Lisa, who had been the instigator of much of their inappropriate behavior, found herself reflecting on her own actions with a maturity that surprised her. "We were treating him like he was some kind of statue in a museum," she said quietly to her classmates. "But he's a real person doing a real job, and we were being completely disrespectful." The group nodded in agreement, each of them processing their own role in the incident and thinking about how they would tell this story to their friends and families back home. Meanwhile, the flow of new tourists into the courtyard continued, but word of the morning's dramatic incident had spread quickly through London's tourist networks. Tour guides were already incorporating the story into their presentations, using it as a perfect example of the real discipline and training required to serve as one of the Queen's Guard. Hotel concierges were sharing the tale with guests planning visits to the palace, emphasizing the importance of showing proper respect. The Italian family had found a quiet spot near the palace gardens where they could process what they had witnessed while their twin boys played softly nearby. The mother kept glancing back toward Thomas's position with a mixture of admiration and concern, her maternal instincts having been triggered by the powerful display of authority she had observed. "Did you see how scared that boy looked?" asked her husband in Italian. "I felt sorry for him, but he needed to learn that lesson. Some things are sacred and must be treated with respect." Her husband nodded thoughtfully, thinking about how he would explain this experience to friends and family when they returned home to Italy. The American college students had claimed a bench where they could review the incredible footage they had captured on their phones. Videos were crystal clear, showing not just Thomas's thunderous command, but also the immediate and dramatic reactions of everyone in the courtyard. They were already debating whether to post the videos on social media, understanding that they had documented something truly special, but wanting to be respectful about how they shared it. "This is going to get millions of views," one student said excitedly, but his classmate held up a cautionary hand. "We need to be careful about how we present this," she replied thoughtfully. "This isn't just entertainment. This is about respect for military service and British traditions. If we post this, we need to make sure people understand the real message." The elderly Canadian couple had found themselves surrounded by other visitors, eager to hear their perspective on what had occurred. Their own military background gave them unique insights into the training and discipline they had just witnessed, and they were happy to share their knowledge with anyone interested in learning. "That young man's voice," the husband explained. "To a fascinated audience, that's the result of years of training. They teach soldiers to project their voices like that so they can be heard over battlefield noise, so they can command attention in emergency situations." What we heard wasn't anger. It was pure, professional authority. His wife nodded in agreement, adding, "Our son went through similar training, though not for ceremonial duties like this. The discipline it takes to stand perfectly still for hours, to maintain that level of awareness and readiness, it's extraordinary. People don't realize what they're really looking at when they see these guards." The street performers had gradually resumed their music, but their melodies seemed more respectful now, as if Thomas's command had reminded everyone present of the solemnity underlying the pageantry of royal traditions. The violin player chose more classical pieces, while the folk singer selected songs that spoke of honor and service rather than light-hearted travel tunes. New tour groups arriving throughout. The day found a courtyard that felt different from the typical tourist destination. Visitors approached Thomas's position with visible reverence. Parents whispered educational comments to their children about military service and British history, and cameras clicked more thoughtfully, capturing images that would be treasured as documentation of genuine cultural experience rather than casual vacation snapshots. The wedding party. After completing their photographs, lingered nearby to observe Thomas with newfound appreciation. The bride, still radiant in her flowing gown, spoke quietly with her new husband about incorporating some acknowledgement of military service into their future together. Inspired by the dedication and professionalism they had witnessed, social media began buzzing with posts about the incident within hours. Videos of Thomas's command were shared thousands of times, accompanied by comments from viewers around the world sharing their own experiences with military protocol and expressing admiration for the Guard's professional handling of the situation. Travel bloggers wrote detailed posts about the importance of respecting cultural traditions. Using the morning's events as a perfect case study, news outlets picked up the story by evening, using it to educate viewers about the real responsibilities and extensive training of the Queen's Guard. Military historians provided context about the traditions behind the ceremonial duties, while cultural experts discussed the importance of maintaining respect for institutions that represent centuries of British heritage. For Thomas himself, the remainder of his duty shift passed peacefully, but he remained acutely aware of the changed atmosphere around his position. Visitors approached with visible respect. Children behaved more thoughtfully. The overall tone of the courtyard reflected the lesson that it's been taught through direct experience rather than posted rules or verbal warnings as his replacement arrived for the next shift, and Thomas prepared to leave his post. He reflected on the morning's events with quiet satisfaction. He had upheld the standards and traditions he had sworn to protect, had educated the public about the boundaries that must be respected, and had demonstrated that behind the ceremonial exterior of the Queen's Guard lay the disciplined heart of a dedicated soldier. The incident would be remembered and retold for years to come, becoming part of the folklore surrounding the Queen's Guard, and serving as a powerful reminder that some traditions are not merely for show, but represent living connections to centuries of duty, honor, and service. Klaus, the German teenager who had inadvertently triggered this memorable lesson, would carry the experience with him for the rest of his life, always remembering the day he learned that respect is not just expected, but absolutely required. When encountering the guardians of royal tradition,